WCSS is a resource to the oil and gas industry in Western Canada to ensure appropriate oil spill preparedness. On average, our equipment is deployed between 10 and 20 times per year when a release has impacted a water body or has the potential to impact a water body. We are a support service and recognize our industry's commitment to a timely release response. Wherever possible, we share lessons that have been learned with our members to assist them in their own preparedness planning. This case study was developed to highlight the typical elements of a release to a water body that any of our member companies may be required to manage. It follows the 7 steps of spill response highlighted in our Spill Responder 100 training program.
This response is something that could happen to any responsible party or a member company. It's a small flow line in an area that has small streams. So spending the time knowing the area and working with the local operations staff really helped us succeed and install the containment recovery that we needed in the initial phases.
I'm Brett Franks, and I'm an emergency response manager responsible for cleanup efforts on this release.
I'm Cherie Dallin, and I'm a subject matter expert / senior project scientist.
My name's Cale Hout. I'm a response instructor in industry, and I also work with WCSS.
On August 15th, 2019, we responded to a release within Washout Creek right behind me. In a high precipitation event, it caused the creek bank to slough and ultimately crimped the pipeline and broke.
Approximately 40 cubic meters of oil was released. Spilled fluids traveled for approximately 6 kilometers. Washout Creek actually runs for 12 kilometers from the break point or point of entry to its confluence with the North Saskatchewan River. And this entire 12 kilometers of watercourse needed to be addressed.
The spill was detected by a company representative as he was doing his daily runs and noticed a hydrocarbon odor, so he stopped to see what was going on. The first course of action was for the company representatives to immediately isolate and shut in the pipeline, which they did within an hour after the response. Initial responders immediately went to the creek with any tools available, mainly absorbent boom.
The responsible party had a number of access roads in the area already, so we were able to utilize those, adding some matting where necessary to protect that infrastructure. We also utilized helicopters. We would fly equipment into strategic locations that were identified by the SCAT assessment, and we also had some tracked vehicles.
They also established access where they could and deployed vacuum trucks to these locations. Access along Washout Creek was limited for a number of reasons. One had to do with the riparian area that we were working in.
Luckily, we had enough road access that we could get the equipment quite close to the locations we wanted to utilize them. From there, we would either basically pack them in with some labor help, or we would hook them up and sling them in with the high line on the helicopters.
Once access locations were determined, they were upgraded throughout the spill response.
For the access, we utilized what's called swamp matting, so it's an 8x14 wooden interlocking mat.
The other methods that were used for upgrading access were bulldozing in trails and clearing brush.
The main priorities of the responders were the protection of life, property, and environment. The initial responders followed their internal reporting structure first. They also contacted AER and subject matter experts. Once subject matter experts arrived on site, they determined that WCSS assets needed to be deployed.
So from the co-op, we had 2 initial response units out of local areas. From there, we also added a wildlife trailer and a boom cache. Specific items outside of those were several drum skimmers and power packs as well.
Provincial and federal regulatory agencies worked with the regulatory liaison to collect information that would help with the incident action plan.
The emergency response phase lasted 5 days before it was called down by the AER.
AER remained in communication with the responsible party for the duration of the spill.
Due to access constraints, The responsible party representatives decided that it was most efficient to have small crews working all the way throughout the creek.
I would guess there was, during the emergency phase, upwards of 60 people on location performing various roles from, vacuum truck operations to labor crews to SMEs from multiple companies and agencies. So we would address our tactics in our morning meetings, divvy up our crews, and then send them out to address those specific locations that were brought up from yesterday's SCAT assessment. So SCAT stands for Shoreline Cleanup and Assessment Technique. So what we do is we calibrate with responders and regulatory agencies to determine endpoints related to the stream that we're working in, the product that we're dealing with, and the conditions which we're trying to achieve.
Incident command system structure was utilized throughout the spill between the responsible party and SMEs on site.
We also had teams, and each team had a leader.
So as an SME in containment recovery and low impact response, my communication would go up the chain through ICS. So I would relay my day's requests and my day's successes to our operations section chief. That information was then fed to the regulatory body, who was pretty much there consistently through the emergency phase of the project.
The creek was split into 1 kilometer divisions, which made it a lot more manageable for us to complete work.
As each crew was assigned their own specific task, a specific hazard identification had to be completed each day and monitored throughout the day.
They managed their own internal communications, hazard assessments, and safety information.
Addressing product in log jams was a big issue. So to make sure that the workers were safe, we'd have them in waders, Tyvek coveralls, and when we'd have to get right in and work amongst the logs, they would likely have anything from safety lanyards and tethered to making sure that even respirators were utilized in the initial days. The product was quite light and fresh, so making sure that respiratory protection was included was definitely part of our tactics.
The responsible party set up an incident command post on a nearby site adjacent to Washout Creek. This site was decommissioned for the time being so that we could safely work on it.
Each access area had a decontamination area to ensure no product made it onto the soil adjacent to the creek.
Because the response was in a fairly public area, we had county roads as well as private oil and gas access locations. Managing people that wanted to maybe stop and have a look were definitely something that we brought up with security measures. Also just the fact that we had local residents very close to the area. So communication with them from the responsible parties aspect was important so that they knew what we were up to, what kind of noise we would be making, and what our efforts were going to entail or how long we may be there. We were also going into the early part of hunting season, so you definitely start seeing an increase in traffic as a result of that, and those additional people had to be made aware of our efforts in the area.
The product that was released was confirmed by the operations as soon as the pipeline release was discovered. It's important to understand the dynamics of the watercourse that we're working in. Washout Creek is a Class C water body that confluxes with the North Saskatchewan River approximately 12 kilometers from the point of entry. It has steep U-shaped banks. It also has lots of in-stream vegetation and cobbles, riffles, runs, plunge pools. All of these are areas where product would accumulate. Washout Creek is also notoriously known for washouts. It originates upstream from a giant wetland. Once this wetland saturates, water is released, causing significant flooding.
Biggest variables that we had to overcome in this response were obviously weather. Weather was probably played a factor in the release itself. The nature of the creek is very volatile. It go up and down with very little rain shed. Just managing access, making sure that people were safe, and then obviously the location itself was very difficult. So utilizing multiple means to get to the containment points that we wanted to work at, utilizing helicopters one day, the next day we would have to walk in because cloud cover was an issue.
The riparian area of Washout Creek consists of mature old-growth forests. This made it really interesting for us in terms of both access and what wildlife we had to deal with on this site. Some of the notable wildlife included things like grizzly bears, great gray owls, cougars, and even barn swallows. Barn swallows are listed as threatened in Alberta. Brook stickleback were the only observed fish in Washout Creek, and this made sense based on its morphology. Initial shoreline cleanup assessment techniques determined that most of the spilled product was contained within the first 6 kilometers of Washout Creek, with the majority of the fluid closer to the point of entry. The main shoreline types on Washout Creek included steep banks, large woody debris, cobbles and sand beds, and vegetated areas. Response and recovery activities spanned over 30 days. Weather played a very integral part in this. Because water levels fluctuated significantly, we had to be prepared. So we staged equipment at various locations, including the confluence of the North Saskatchewan River.
During the response, the nature of the stream we were working in, it's a very volatile stream. Rainfall events can bring the water levels up within hours, and significant changes. We're talking 1 to 2 feet of change. So your boom sets had to be constantly adjusted for that. So making sure that we had enough line, enough anchor to hold when the pressure of that water would increase, and allow us to adjust our boom angles, our hand lines, and our skimmer locations was pretty vital.
Documents that needed to be managed were spill reporting requirements, incident command system positions and contact information, detailed site sketches that were updated every day, chronological record of events that were updated daily, safety controls like hazard assessments and incidents, negotiations and agreements with contractors and landowners, and updated plans to support the incident action plan.
So as a responder, my role is an operational one. So I'm out there installing boom, setting up control points. So my information on the day's tactics and successes would be relayed up to our section chief in operations. They would relay that information then to regulatory bodies who were on site looking for updates.
One of the biggest learnings we had on this response was the efficiency of communication between responsible parties and regulatory agencies. Communication between those two that's open can make a spill response much more effective and easy on all parties.
Plans built to support the incident action plan included monitoring, wildlife, remediation action, communication, access, and waste management. These plans were developed within 13 hours of the initial spill response. We also developed a shoreline cleanup assessment technique plan.
Initial containment operations involved a containment boom placed about 6 kilometers downstream of the point of entry. As soon as that was put in, a secondary backup boom was placed immediately behind or downstream of the initial containment boom. Once the secondary containment boom was in place, additional boom was located in areas of heavy product.
So as an initial responder, I was on site about 12 hours after receiving the call. When I got to location, we'd already established several control points I could see when I did the helicopter overflight. So we had basic containment already in place. There was a number of assets already in sight, including the 2 ISRUs, a wildlife trailer, and drum skimmers.
Following that, we set up 10 different spots where we deployed boom. These boom sets were set in the creek with using shoreline pins, but because of the nature of Washout Creek, they had to be able to float freely on those pins.
I would say addressing the changing flow was a big lesson learned. Making sure that your boom sets were very solid, but yet adjustable, allowed us to maintain that containment, but also not lose it if we had varying flow, either up or down.
2 Pedco skimmers were used for recovery along Washout Creek during spill response activities. Initially, recovery wasn't great due to untrained operators, but once the SMEs were able to train the operators appropriately, recovery volumes went up significantly. A groove drum skimmer was used in an area that had low water velocity, and product recovery was phenomenal. Pedco skimmers can collect a lot of product, but they also collect a lot of fresh water at the same time. Groove drum skimmers are very efficient and only collect product with leaving all the water behind. Also with the groove drum skimmer, debris tends to not be an issue and it can be unmanned for longer periods of time. Although not part of the WCSS equipment cache, multiple portable drum vacs were used throughout the spill response. These were used in areas of poor accessibility and they were actually dropped in via helicopter.
1 and 2 inch pumps were used to circulate water from the creek and wash debris and oil that had accumulated in areas that we didn't have great access to recovery points. We washed the creek using low pressure, high volume to prevent submerged and sunken oil.
Because of the large amount of shoreline work that we had to address, we utilized a lot of hand tools, both from the WCSS units and sourced rakes, shovels, shears, saws, hand saws.
Leaf blowers were used to direct foam and sheen to recovery locations. Pool skimmers were used for collecting oil, debris, and foam and placed in 1 cube tote sacks as well.
Sheen and sediment became an issue at the break point, and this was because the bank was so saturated with hydrocarbons. Initially, we were washing the banks with water, but the banks began to become really saturated and we had a lot of slumping issues, which in turn caused a lot of sedimentation issues. In order to manage the sediment and the sheen, we deployed bales. The bales were locally sourced so that we wouldn't introduce any type of weeds or non-native vegetation into the area. After we were done with sheen management, we put the bales up on the shoreline and cut the twine and left the bales to biodegrade.
Some of our largest areas that we had to do recovery on were quite far from access. Because we had large volumes of oil, we set up about a 400-foot vacuum truck pipeline in order to allow us to set up multiple drum skimmers and then address a large volume of oil in a few hours.
So as this is the breakpoint location, it was obviously covered in oil at the time of the release. Spill response activities were directed initially right at this location. As you can tell, it's gotten pretty clean since that time. Also behind me, a lot of the natural features like log jams helped us in containment techniques. Happens on every spill almost, that you have natural features that assist, but they can also hinder efforts down the road that you also have to mitigate for. Like behind me, the trees that have fallen in the water are excellent containment measures.
Access along Washout Creek was really limited due to both the creek itself and the riparian area. We have a lot of old growth forests around here, which made it really difficult to get anything in. So we did most of our access via foot. In order to get people to these spots, we needed to use a helicopter. We used helicopters to move everything from large woody debris to people to cube sacks full of oil.
So areas like the one I'm standing on were perfect staging locations for the portable drum vac. It's pretty wide open, so the helicopter that we were using to long line equipment in and out had a good opportunity to drop things and pick them up here. The one issue he ran into was the height of the trees, so he had to use an extra long line to make sure he didn't touch any trees.
Because of the large number of people that we were moving around to address specific locations, we would fly crews in. So making sure that anyone who'd never worked around a helicopter received a very detailed briefing on the operations and the safety of working around that asset was definitely something that you don't see every day in a response. So it was a big part of our daily safety was addressing new crew members who had never worked around a helicopter before.
Wildlife wasn't a major issue, but they have to be deterred nonetheless.
We used one wildlife unit from WCSS, and this unit contained everything that we possibly needed to mitigate wildlife on the site. This included mylar tapes, scary eyes, flags, kites, and even pitfall trap material.
One of the major things that I've learned with dealing with spills is for company representatives to have trained personnel. Not only does it save money, but it saves response time and cleanup time.
I think one of the biggest things that worked well was communication. We had a central hub utilizing the ICS structure that relayed the information on what tactics we were going to be utilizing, and using SCAT specifically to drive our tactics was very effective in this location.
We learned a lot of valuable lessons on this spill. One of the important things we learned was to keep your site clean. Not only does it prevent wildlife from coming into your spill site, it also presents a good message to people who come onto your site. It shows that you understand what you're doing and that you understand the natural environment.
At the end of the day, we can't address every single watercourse with control points, but what we can do is utilize local knowledge. The operations group in this area specifically were very aware of where we could access the stream, where it went, and what areas were going to be difficult to access. So I think that was definitely a big lesson learned.
Things for us on this spill went so smoothly because we were in constant communication with each other. We were in communication with the regulators, and we were in communication with the responsible party. So it made it really easy for us to do what we needed to do to clean up the site.
WCSS would like to thank the member company for sharing the information that enabled the development of this case study. Although a release to water is inherently a negative situation, the sharing of information and lessons learned can only benefit the industry as a whole. There are hundreds of oil and gas companies in Western Canada that must assess the risk of their operations, and we know firsthand that they are ensuring the ideal level of preparedness by participating in WCSS training programs. For more information, please visit our website.